I've never recorded in 4K. I didn't even notice that setting. So I'm just gonna try it, but I guess I shouldn't do a long video. But I realized that in a way self-dialogue is like talking oneself out of one's ego. Talking oneself as a different self from a different perspective about different perspectives instead of just one's own limited perspective creates those other brain cells. And then in dialogue with each other, we might actually see that we're one consciousness, we're not separate. Another benefit of self-dialogue I thought of is that when I do self-dialogue, I generally get up, get dressed, put on a bit of makeup, whereas some of those days I might not have done that if I wasn't talking to myself and thinking that maybe I would share it one day. So I think it's beneficial to do that. I feel like I have a purpose even if that day I don't have anything to do. And the purpose is just to communicate with myself in a different way as opposed to yada yada yada. And so Mania, I feel, grows the brain. It's light training. It's a different form of exercise. The light of perception, light is what actually grows brain cells. Seeing something, which is light, but seeing something new will create new brain cells. Just like when the cell perceives something via a receptor on its membrane, there's a cascade of changes in the cell. There's different DNA transcribed, or it'll even produce DNA based on what it's perceiving if it doesn't have the DNA for that. And Dr. Bruce Lipton talks about genetic engineering genes which can actually write new DNA based on the perception of the environment. Well, our brains can write new brain cells based on the perception of the environment. But if we're perceiving abstractions, it's just going to create brain cells for abstracting the prefrontal cortex. It's not going to create the whole cortex. Abstraction is division. It divides us. It's division. It gets rid of our vision. And the oneness is vision. We all share this external reality, supposedly. We just don't share the same bodies, but everything else we share. So technically we have access to the exact same vision. But we're living in our abstractions, which are division. We don't share that part. Those are personal. We make life personal when it's not personal. It's all non-personal. And so the level of consciousness is the level of perception. It's the level of light. And we need to perceive at those higher levels, perceive love in order to grow the brain cells of love, to mirror that in our brains. And map consciousness gives us that blueprint. It gives us that visual blueprint, that whole brain visual blueprint. It's a different game with different rules, not reward and punishment, which is programmed into our dopamine reflex. It could be called love and create, or love and learn. Love and learn. That's the new game. We're looking for more content, but we don't question how we see. I would say that the brain creates matter. I had this insight because I realized perception through the brain creates matter. So for example, if I have an insight into nature and I'm looking at a tree, I might plant a tree, which creates matter. So my brain, as life, as perception, can facilitate that matter unfolding or being created. And the same life force that grows the brain is the same life force that grows the tree. So it's that life force. So are we perceiving that life force and co-creating with it? Or are we destroying life in favor of and even further, there could be other matter out there that we don't perceive. But if we have a higher level of consciousness, we could perhaps perceive that matter. And then that matter is made manifest through the perception of it. So it's not only perceiving the necessity of trees and then planting one and seeing that matter get transformed, but we can probably transform other unseen things into the seen world that are there, we just can't see. And think about dark matter and dark energy. It could just be dark because we don't have the brain cells to perceive it. But we have to be looking for something new. We have to be looking for something different. We have to be looking for something the next level beyond of the thing we just saw. We can never say, oh, this is it. It's never it. We can say, oh, that's nice. What's next? But not this is it. There's no ultimate anything. Learning is infinite. And if we realize that, we would have never stopped learning. I feel our separative actions lead to our decline. So our ego is sort of our dopamine, is our personal reward, is our personal pleasure. Me, me, me. And oxytocin is we. It requires some kind of connection in order to release oxytocin. And because we think in our separate ways, we don't think together. We need to start thinking together and seeing things together and extrapolating together. And I doubt dopamine and oxytocin can coexist. So if we're in our dopamine structures of separation, we're not creating oxytocin, we're not creating connection. So then we feel disconnected. And just like people say the most important thing for their health and longevity is relationships, it's part of that is oxytocin. It keeps our brains connected to our bodies. And when we're connected to our bodies, we can see, we can relate, we can make gestures, we can reach out. We feel connected, so we can reach out and make connections. And going into personal bliss is the same thing as going towards death. Look at what's happening with all this fentanyl crisis. The person who dies in a very blissful state, personal bliss. They probably go into like enlightenment for however long, and then they're dead. Like that's a pathway to enlightenment for sure, but it's not one that is embodied. It's not one that's connected. Enlightenment can be a disembodied state. Enlightenment is death. One gets to that light and goes probably into the light body realm, but it disconnects one from one's physical body. So oxytocin, released from the brain, going into the body, is a connection of love of the brain to the body, and it's the brain loving the body and the body loving the brain, and that both are instruments of love and perception and learning. And actually could be the brain learning how to love, the brain learning how to release oxytocin, and for us to become an oxytocin dominant culture. And those are the measures of wellness, not one's personal bank account. So it seems the brain unfolds matter. If we live in abstraction, that's what we see in front of us, and it's not really matter, it's sort of an image. Whereas if we're living in actuality and perceiving with that, we're really in touch with the matter of the universe, and we can actually unfold that matter. And it could be that 95% is dark energy, because 95% of us are living in 5% of our brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. So the rest of what's out there in actuality is invisible, because we're living in that invisible realm. We're living in the world of images and abstractions. So today in the shower, I had an insight about possible hypotheses for other biological phenomena. I feel like one of the mechanisms of medication, some medications for mental illness, could be actually that it stops blood flow to the brain. It stops the blood flow to the whole brain. Maybe it continues to direct it to the prefrontal cortex. And I previously talked about how it's kind of like a chemical ego band-aid. So stopping the blood flow to the other parts of the brain is stopping the brain growth. It's stopping the brain from outgrowing the ego. It's stopping the brain from having that energy to transcend the ego. And I feel like that could actually be why a lot of people on those meds get diabetes and strokes and heart attacks, is because it's messing with blood flow. So Dr. Mercola talked to that doctor who said that, who's talking about blood flow and things like that. And I was thinking about, it wouldn't just be those medications, but blood flow is impeded in general in a lot of conditions perhaps, and these are just my hypotheses. I'm not saying these are true or science, or there could be studies about this, I don't know, but I feel like there's something to do within diabetes that there's not proper blood flow to the pancreas. So it's possible that the trouble is that it can't bind insulin because it can't get blood flow. So it becomes unable to really produce and secrete insulin or bind insulin because there's no blood flow to the pancreas. There's no blood communication. And I was thinking about how people then inject insulin into their fat cells, and it could actually be a way for the body, because generally a lot of people who inject insulin, they end up gaining a lot of weight. And it could be the way for the body to actually distribute the insulin through the fat cells and through the lymphatic system, bypassing the blood system, because the blood flow to the pancreas has been reduced through, say, psych meds. Or it could also be that when there's too much sugar and all these processed chemicals, that could actually mess up the blood flow to the pancreas. It could almost maybe reduce the blood flow to the pancreas, because the pancreas is so overactive that it almost sets up this like autoimmune reaction, not in terms of inflammation as much, but in terms of the fact that blood flow can't get there, or it chooses almost not to go there anymore. And then people with diabetes sometimes end up with their limbs amputated, and it could be that there's this blood flow problem to the limbs because the lymphatic fluid is like pooling, and there's insulin in the lymphatic system instead of in the blood, and then basically it's a blood flow problem. So really, it's a lot of things could actually just be blood flow problems. Problems with the capillaries, and people who gain weight often are less active, and then that just actually compounds the problem. And movement is important for the brain too. The movement of perception. Perception moving around the visual field. Perception not from the focal view, but also from the peripheral vision. And being able to see from other perspectives. Being able to see. And map consciousness is using our eyes differently to unfold something different. To see something different. And we go into that field of unseen that we see, but nobody else can see it. So it's a matter of having other people able to see this whole living movement of life, which is right there, that we're all living in, but we don't see because we're stuck in 5% of the field, which is habit. Our energy and our attention is being consumed by the machine of habit and thought. And mania breaks us away from that in order to act differently, to create something different, to create as we would when we're fully alive. It changes our way of being because it changes our way of seeing. And when we can see clearly, we don't need programs and we don't need habits. Programs prevent seeing clearly. And I actually feel like one of the troubles in map consciousness is that we are seeing so clearly and we're not part of the program, but we're interacting with people who are programmed. So how do we engage in dialogue in order to exist as living beings together, not as two programs butting heads?